Hello and welcome to What Now with Anna and Eric. Um,
Huh.
Here I am once again indoors. Eric is again outside, which just goes to show.
Out in the wilderness, enjoying God's creation as we talk about the Bible. That's what I do.
Which is
That's
just
what
so
I do.
deep. It's really
I
deep.
know.
It's
It's
good
really
stuff.
where I connect. So it works out.
So we're looking at Proverbs chapter 5 through Proverbs chapter 24. And then the reading plan kind of goes in a different direction, which must mean that the other Proverbs are not by Solomon, would then be my guess.
That's kind
I
of
haven't
where,
looked at it, but
yeah,
I'm making
I'm
that
all over
assumption.
the place. Yeah. So that would be because I have not, I went a little bit ahead, obviously, because I've now learned where our days line up for the podcast. But,
Yeah.
but yes,
A little bit off. That's
but
okay.
it's all right.
But this was cool. I was consistently reminded of why I like Proverbs. It has just like because I was as I was reading through it, I was making a list of like, you know how self-help books are like a big deal. Everybody likes
Yes.
your self-help books.
Listen,
And I
I've
was
got
like,
maybe a few.
so I started making a list of everything that Proverbs hits on. So and I'm sure I missed things and I generalized some things too to hit under larger categories, but like
I
parenting,
was gonna say
relationships.
if you write adultery down every time it came up, that would probably take up majority of your
Oh,
list.
that'd be a lot.
But yes, go ahead. What's your
Yeah.
list look like?
So parenting, relationships, business, mental health, finances, leadership, court proceedings, personal growth. Those were just the ones that were very obvious to me. And some things I didn't put down because I was like, well, this could kind of be a subcategory under one of these. But it really just hits on so much, which is cool.
Well, and once again, I'm looking at it through the study Bible, and what's cool is when it gets into that wisdom and folly part and it's got a list and its characteristics, reputation, and results, and it's got a list of the wise and a list of the foolish, like, and it puts verses that kind of line up to that, and I'm like, that's really cool. Like, looks
That is cool,
at,
actually.
like, yeah, but like, it's like, help others with good advice. The foolish lack judgment. The wise enjoy wisdom. The foolish enjoy foolishness. That one's pretty obvious.
Yeah.
but it kind of goes back and forth, and gives you the different verses, especially in 14, where it breaks it down, because that's kind of where it says this is what a wise person does, this is what a foolish person does, and it breaks down each one, which was really cool to kind of see that comparison. So
Yeah.
fun times. Fun. Listen, this is your book right here. You've been waiting for this one, so I'm
It's a
just
good
gonna
one.
follow your lead with this one.
I generally enjoy Proverbs. It really is my favorite Old Testament book. Something that I did think about this time, which I have not thought about previously when I've read Proverbs, and again, this goes back to reading it chronologically because you think about these things differently. But I was especially struck by the chapters on adultery, and I was like, if you think about it, Solomon's mom and dad did what he told everybody not to do. You know what I mean? Like, there's all of these
Yeah,
verses about adultery where his dad David had adultery with his mom and then killed her husband. And then there's all these
yeah.
passages on parenting and about disciplining your kids. And there are verses about David never disciplining his kids and how badly that went. So
Well,
it
I
was
mean,
just
he
I
did,
was struck by that
and he
personal
did ask
dynamic.
for, yeah, and he did ask for wisdom. So maybe it was like, wow, now I see that my dad didn't really have it all together, and
These
I
these
better
real
warn
things
some
screwed up.
people. Yeah,
So it
I'm
was
just gonna go
interesting.
ahead and marry all the women that I'm with, so that
Yeah,
I'm
he
not.
really did not follow his own advice very well in different
Well,
instances.
that's what I made a note of. I'm like, he writes all this stuff about adultery, and does he get a pass because he married all the women that he was? I don't know how that works,
Yeah.
but you know
And I
what?
think that
It's
again
all
goes
right.
back to remembering that the different types of literature that this is. So when we look at the life of Solomon, that's historical literature. So it kind of just says what he did, but it doesn't necessarily say yeah, don't do that. That was a bad idea. But we can see that through the consequences of his life. And then you look at
Yeah,
the wisdom literature of Proverbs and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, pretty clearly, good old Solomon should not have done that.
for sure. For sure. But yeah, I just, like I said, I can sit in here and I love that you can kind of piece it together. And there's just a lot of just catchy phrases and catchy verses that like can stick with you. And you're like, oh yeah, when I need this, or when I have a situation where I'm not sure how this is going to go, wow, I can go to this and say, oh yeah, let's look at this. What is the difference between humility and pride? Oh, wait a second. I can go right through this in 18 and look at what it's like to be humble and what it's like to be prideful. And you can kind of dive into each of these when it comes to things you're going to do for life. So,
Yeah. It was, and I struggled with this one as far as like, because we typically pick out some verses that we like and we talk about them.
mhm.
But honestly, it was just kind of like, these are all great verses. And one of the coolest things for me about Proverbs is I actually started at one point um, memorizing different proverbs. I started memorizing chapters because it was kind of like, you look through different parts of the Bible, like if like let's say that you started memorizing numbers, uh you wouldn't
You're a lot better person
necessarily
than me.
you wouldn't necessarily use all of those verses in your day to day, like, oh, that one time where there was 50,000 people playing the trumpet. Like, you're not necessarily going to bring that up. But with
Yeah.
Proverbs, it's every single verse is a good practical verse. And so what I started doing and what I found was very productive for my life was starting to memorize Proverbs, because then it was even cooler when I was in these situations with business or relationships or finances or generosity or whatever it was, and I would have that verse that I memorized pop up into my brain and it was just there, to
Yeah.
access.
Well, and this is like what's funny. I always look for it like, okay, I get that, especially something like this where there is gold, like in every verse, there's going to be a time where you can come back to that verse. So I read it. I'm like, okay, what is standing out to me now? And it's just simple things like reading through 18 and 18, Proverbs 18:13. To answer before listening, that is folly and shame. Like, and
I put that
all
one
this
down
week,
too.
but and for me, all this week has been about this Black Lives Matter, about what's going on with this social injustice. And I'm like, my heart's breaking for it, but I don't understand it enough. And it's like, where is my voice in it? And I can say certain things or repost certain things that I see, but it's like if I was just to speak out, I don't know if I I can speak out on what I'm feeling and and do it justice. So it was like that just stuck out. I'm like, okay, let's start listening. Like, what more information can I get? And that just stuck out to me. So it's really cool as I really think when I first was kind of taught or guided through reading the Bible, the biggest thing that was kind of honed in on was that this is the living word of God. And you have to let God move through your reading and let God kind of highlight what he wants to highlight. And you'll get those things that kind of perk you up and be like, oh, wait a second, I better highlight that or write that down or make a note of that because that means something in what you're going through. So that's why I think reading through things over and over again, I mean, you could very easily do the Proverbs a day every month and and be good with life. I think
Yeah.
that's a good way to go about it. So
Especially since it hits on so many different topics too. And that was one of the coolest things that I found about reading the proverb of the day is it was kind of like there was always a verse, because
yeah.
it is so diverse. The verses are diverse. And it was cool to be able to look at it, and every time you read it something different would stick out to you, which is true really of the Bible as a whole. But the cool thing about Proverbs is it's not like you're just necessarily reading the same story over and over. It's
Mhm.
you're picking out every single time this bit of wisdom that practically applies to your life. So that was one of the coolest things about it for me. There are some
Yeah.
there are some interesting proverbs too. You know, there's the ones where you read them and you're like, well, that seems obvious. Like there's one in there that says something like, a truthful witness speaks the truth and a false witness pours out lies. And you're like, yeah.
But see, these are points where I see him speaking that to a group of people, and just because his position of power, they're like, come on.
Yeah. It's
Did I
like
freeze?
everybody knows that. You do have to think about though, I mean, when I was looking at, I was also looking at the context of, so he like says that at one point, the really obvious one liner, and then he actually deep dives a couple verses later about, okay, now that we've established that false witnesses pour out lies, let's talk about those false witnesses. And you know, it kind of goes into more of that sort of thing. But it's also interesting to think about, you know, what necessarily seems really obvious to me is also one of those verses that might really stick out to somebody else, where they really just needed to be, you know, because sometimes you need to be slapped in the face with the truth, right? Like you're going through life and you're just kind of like okay with it. You're okay with the way things work, and you're okay with how life is happening. And sometimes what you need is somebody to say the really obvious statement of, hey, that's not right. and refocus a little bit on that and figure it out. So I liked those ones, those obvious
Well,
ones.
I think, and I think a lot of them you can read and you can gut check in a lot of them. I mean, 1922, what a person desires is unfailing love. Better to be poor than a liar. It's like, okay, you know, like, yeah, we want this unfailing love. And it's that, and I look at that is that relationship part, not only that relationship, like I said, it's how that speaks to you. And I put a note right here. It's like, you desire that unfailing love. Well, God desires that unfailing love from you too. So it's better to be poor than a liar. Like, don't keep things from God. Like, don't build that relationship on you lying to him or keeping things from him. It's like, no, that desire, if it's a relationship, both parties desire that same thing. So it is simple verses that you can sit and meditate and pray on and really be like, wow, that's actually a lot deeper than I thought it was going to be. And it can kind of take you those places. So,
yeah, which is, it's very cool.
That's what's really cool for me when I look at it is I'm a very, all right. Do I keep freezing?
You did freeze just now. Vocally.
See, should I just mess with you? Like,
just pretend.
Just act like it.
Pretend like you're frozen.
I do. So one of those, where was it? Oh, Proverbs 20. I don't know what version you're reading, but the one I have, wine is a mocker and beer a brawler. Whoever is led astray by them is not wise. Like, haha, there we go. Like, yep, drink that, you're going to get into bar fights. Like Solomon even knew bar fights were coming.
Yeah. There was a lengthy metaphor about that in one of the chapters. I don't remember which one it was, but it was something like, as the wine sparkles in the glass, don't look at it, something.
Don't look at it.
I was like, this is so funny to read. It was pretty good.
Yeah, I need to just start using more Bible language, like sluggards. I highlighted the word sluggards. Sluggards do not plow in season, so at harvest time they look but find nothing. I want to call people sluggards. Like when the kids are being lazy, I'm gonna bring that word back.
You sluggard.
You sluggards. Look at you not plowing your fields in season. I don't know.
How dare you?
I don't know. How dare you?
Or you can go look to the ant, and then you throw in your thous. Look to the ant, thou sluggard, depending on.
Yeah, see? I'm telling you. but really Solomon's got the one-liners. That was what I really took away from this whole thing. There's these one-liners, these zingers that just can hit you at the right time, I think.
True.
But
there are also some verses in there. So I would say number one, when you're looking at Proverbs, it's cool to change up your translation. Just really with any of them as well. But some of these one-liners, like when you change your translation, I've had a couple times, because I originally read all of them, the NIV, New International Version, which is closer to a literal translation. And then I did switch to NLT, New Living Translation, which is closer to a free translation.
yes.
And some of the verses that I had previously read and even memorized before, when I switched translations, I was like, that means something totally different than when I thought it meant the first time I read it. Because it just like, the way that I read it previously, I didn't think about it the same. And so switching up translations can be very helpful. There's also this point in the NIV where there are two verses right next to each other that say the exact opposite thing. Like one of them says, don't discipline a fool because he won't take wisdom. And the very next verse says, discipline a fool so that he can become wise. And I remember reading that as a teenager and going up to my dad and being like, these things say the total opposite. How am I supposed to take this? Like,
do you think
literally switch
Do you
words.
think Solomon was just covering all of his bases? Like, he was just like, if I make sure I say everything, I for sure won't be wrong. Like,
exactly. Yeah.
no,
If you switch to NLT, then it does change the second one, and then you're like, okay, now it makes sense. But
there you go. So if God's not speaking to you through a certain translation, just pick another translation and see what he has to say. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
But
there's also those verses in there that talk about bribes and encouraging giving out bribes. That was interesting. Give me your thoughts on that, Eric.
Giving out bribes, I think it's a really good way to listen. That's a parenting technique. I think that falls under the parenting
truth. I do that as an aunt.
Wisdom. See, there you go. And that's how when you look at bribery, if you need wisdom and you need your kids to do something, bribery and working through that is definitely a parent tip. So that should be under the wise. Sure.
And it does do that kind of same thing where it says something and then it says the opposite, because there's a verse that goes into so Proverbs 21:14. A gift given in secret soothes anger, and a bribe concealed in the cloak pacifies great wrath. I think I accidentally switched translations halfway through. And then Proverbs 22:16 says, one who oppresses the poor to increase his wealth, and one who gives gifts to the rich, both come to poverty. So it's it kind of goes back and it's like, okay, I did say that, but it's kind of like a clarifying point. Like, all right, but don't do it to the detriment of poor people and just because you're a jerk.
Yeah. Oh, that and just above that, sluggard used again. I'm telling you, I should have counted the number of times sluggard was used in this.
One.
It's a good.
We should bring it back into the English language.
I just make a note of it. Just throw it in there when you can. You know? Just
like a word of the day.
That's kind of where I was at with it. So did you, now this is where I was wondering, did we go into, we only went through 22:16, right?
No, we went through 24.
24, that's where I was at. All right, perfect. Because that was, I like the 30 sayings of the wise. And it actually had saying 1, saying 2. Like, if you're going to memorize something, I mean, these like, if you're going to a party, have like at least 10 of these in your pocket to throw out there.
Yeah.
So that's where I think going through those, if you're going to do memorization, sit in 30 sayings of the wise and bring those to the next business meeting and just throw one out there.
Yeah.
Like simple, do not move an ancient boundary stone. set up by your ancestors. Like if you're talking and people are like, man, we want to go in a different direction with this company, be like, yeah, I wouldn't move that ancient boundary stone. You can just use it. I
Well,
just throw it out there. It works.
what's so interesting even about that verse, because Proverbs 24 is one of the Proverbs that I started memorizing. And it was cool, first of all, to see how often in my life verses from that proverb would pop up in my brain when I'd be talking to somebody and be like, oh, wow, I can think of a verse that applies to that. But even the ancient boundary stone one, like a friend of mine had lived with some neighbors that were very passionate about their boundary lines. And I was thinking about this verse. And I was like,
truth and wisdom actually talking about a boundary line.
I literally did speak about this boundary line verse. And I was like, but I realize that they're being really rude about it, but it is a boundary line and God wants you to respect them. So I would just say, go ahead and move your thing.
That has been here for a while. May I say it is an ancient boundary line that we're looking at here. And if I look at what God says, you should not. Oh, that's great.
It was so funny, though.
See, you never know when they're going to come into play.
Proverbs. Helpful in all life situations.
You never know when you're going to need that wisdom.
It was funny that you brought that verse
even when you're having a property dispute.
Yeah.
It's random, but you know what? It works. One of the ones that stuck out with me is saying 3. Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared. Watch out. If they're hot-tempered, I don't know.
No.
So don't combat anger with anger. Just try to diffuse the situation. So that stuck out to me.
There are a lot of talking verses too about don't talk. The one where it said, even fools are thought wise if they don't speak up. I was like, true.
See, even if you, that's why I let you talk a lot of the time in here, because even I can look smarter just by hanging out and listening to you talk. So it works out. I'm telling you what though, but for those of you next week is going to be the week if you're going to tune in, because next week I think is when we get into the Song of Songs. If you're looking for love, or if your marriage just needs a little kickstart, next week.
Should we pre-warn? Listen, do not tune in with your children next week.
You know what? Get a blanket, get a glass of wine if that's what you're into, light a candle, and let's just talk about love. That's what next week's going to be.
I remember, I probably shouldn't talk about this till next week, but now I'm going to talk about it. I remember reading, different chapters in the Bible, and I originally started out with the Children's Bible, which if you want to keep your children from reading Song of Solomon for a while, children's Bibles are great. But I remember first coming upon Song of Solomon and going to my parents, I'm like, what is this? This is horrifying.
So listen, because we're given a preview, we're giving a quick preview.
Oh, we are. Yeah.
I'm gonna if your kids are in the room listening to you, turn it off in 3, 2, 1. The start of Song of Songs, the information where in the study Bible going into it, it says saturated with stories of sexual escapades, secret rendezvous, and extramarital affairs. There we go. Stay tuned next week, y'all.
That's what we're going to be. Thankfully, it is only one day of reading. Like you take one day, you read it all, you move on.
Oh, I don't know. This is gonna be an interesting one. I don't know.
The metaphors in it.
I'm excited.
Yeah. Okay. I keep wanting to talk about it, but we gotta save it. We gotta save it.
We got it. So listen, what's our next step here, Anna? This week, what's our next step?
Step. So last week my challenge was to read the proverb of the day, which next week by that. And I do want to add a secondary challenge to that, which would be start memorizing some verses from Proverbs. Maybe just start out at one. If you're like, memorizing is a bit of a task for me, just start out one verse. They're really just one-liners. I mean, how many of us have memorized quotes or jokes or one-liners that we like to throw at people? And Proverbs is just a one-liner. Think of how many people you could call a sluggard, and that would be great.
Yeah. And think of how many lines from The Office you have memorized. Really, if you watch it, how many lines in there do you have memorized? You can get one of these. I say that because I can probably memorize a lot of those. And I don't know how many of these I could throw at you real quick, but
yeah,
it works out. So
that's
all
my
right,
next
so
step.
that was the challenge. So that's the next step, memorization.
That is going to be my next step.
Look, just pick a few out. Yeah, there you go. I love it. You're so smart. That's why wisdom is getting to you. That's why you memorize this, because you got, and see, the foolish just sit here and don't speak, and we get to be wise in proximity. Oh, all right.
I do want to say something really quick too. There is one of the verses in Proverbs chapter 19:27 says, "Stop listening to instruction, my son, and you will stray from the words of knowledge." And I think this very much applies to memorization and applies to reading the proverb of the day. Because when you stop listening to instruction, you stop getting into your Bible, you do start to stray away from it when it's not at the forefront of your mind and you're not thinking about it consistently and disciplined. And that's really where the power of reading the Bible comes from. Keep it there, keep it in your head. So it's just a side thought.
See that? That's the exclamation point to put on this. See, we were getting into the next week stuff, but that's your exclamation point right there. 1927 right there. Stop listening to boom. There you go. Boom. Listen to what people are telling you.
Boom.
All right, Anna. This was, once again, outdoors. It started to rain a little bit. I was getting a little nervous, but then it stopped, so I was good. So it worked out. Next step, I'm gonna memorize one of these. I'm gonna at least get one of these.
Do it.
So that's my hope. That's my hope, because the kids and I have been diving into it. We haven't gotten to one a day, but we have been diving into it with them. So that's been good.
That's awesome.
What's good is the small part of it. Yeah, so I did stick to it a little bit. At least we're getting into Proverbs. That was good. So that's drawing us close together. I'm telling you what, you are guiding my life very well. I am listening to your instruction. And it's working for me.
Well, there you go.
So
you're welcome, my son.
Awesome. Oh, all right.
All right. So
awesome.
Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening to What Now with Anna and Eric. Enjoy your
next week.
sunshine.
Get your blanket, get your comfy spot and your candle. It's gonna be a good one.
It's gonna be interesting. It's gonna be interesting.
Yes, that's for sure.
Yeah, so look forward to that. Keep in mind your audience for next week.
Yes, yeah, make sure. Just make sure, because we're gonna get into some things. Yeah. So watch yourself.
So we'll see ya. I'm Anna. That's Eric.
I'm Eric. Darn right.
Have a great day.
See ya.